Accessible technology drives revenue growth and compliance. Thanks for joining us today. I'm your host, Mark Lindsey. I'm a senior member of technical staff here at ECG. I've worked for over 25 years doing engineering and product design within internet and voice service provider space with a focus on internet routing, call processing, and engineering for regulatory compliance, cybersecurity, and I've worked with technology from Cisco, Oracle, Metaswitch, Microsoft, TransUnion, and others over those years. I'm glad to welcome Michal Nowicki, Senior Associate Attorney at Marashlian Donahue. His extensive experience in the US and Canadian telecommunications laws, and his focus is on helping clients comply with complex regulations and avoid costly compliance pitfalls. He's got experience that spans exemptions from USF contributions to FCC E911 rules and state public utility commissions regulations. Mr. Nowicki is recognized authority on accessibility laws, including the CVAA and the ACA, and has a proven track record of advocating for disability inclusion. He successfully worked with the National Federation of the Blind, Comcast, DirecTV, and has been instrumental in shaping policies to expand accessibility requirements. He's got a deep knowledge of disability access law affecting telecommunications and IT industries, and so that makes him an invaluable resource for businesses looking to enhance digital products and services. So welcome, Michal.
Thank you, Mark. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. It is a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to talking to all of you about accessibility. Before we dive into the weeds of accessibility, I'll give a little bit more background about myself. As Mark mentioned, I am a telecom and digital accessibility attorney. I have been practicing law for over 5 years now, and I am an expert in both US and Canadian digital accessibility laws, including the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act, CVAA, telecommunications relay services for people with hearing and speech disabilities, and the Accessible Canada Act, ACA. But I don't come into accessibility from just a legal perspective. I am also, and have been all my life, totally blind. And as a result, I have relied on various assistive technologies for both personal, educational, and work use, including screen reading software, Braille, voice assistants, various. I've relied on various technologies, both hardware and software, to get to where I am now. So I bring a personal experience perspective in addition to my perspective as a regulatory accessibility and telecom compliance attorney.
Yeah, that's great. I really look forward to hearing some more about where things are and how telecom firms can design for accessibility and other kinds of technology projects as well. In the past few years, we've seen a lot of penalties for voice communication projects and products that have violated some laws related to accessibility. So as myself as an engineer and a product designer, I want to know just what the constraints are that are set by the law so that I can comply with them. But I think that simply designing to avoid penalties is kind of heartless. It's kind of a corrupt reason. As a created human being, I want to make the best possible services and do as much good as I can in all the ways that I can, in as many places as I can, for as long as I can. And that means by making things that really work for a broad audience, for as many people as possible. So I really think it's common. Really what I say there is common to a lot of product designers and engineers who really are working in the public interest. So I think this is a shared interest, but it's an area where a lot of us don't have a lot of really hands-on expertise or feedback. So I think basically the feedback from regulators by doing enforcement actions is actually informative because it really does help us to see kind of what the constraints are and see examples of how this works out. And I know we're going to talk about a few of those. So this session really, for all of you watching, is intended to educate product managers and engineers and others with an interest in providing great products, maximizing the size of their market, and managing enforcement risks, especially for communications and internet service provider type of operations. So Michael's going to introduce us some of the key reasons for making communication services accessible. And then I'm going to add in some info from the perspective of an engineer and product designer. So we'll have some questions, some time for questions at the end. So please send in your questions on the Zoom chat. If you're watching this on recording, then you'll get to see those live Q&A as they've come in. But no matter what the reasons are we have for designing for maximum usability and accessibility, we always have to make a business case. So Michael, can you start us off talking about the basic business aspects of designing for accessibility?
Absolutely. The first point I would like to emphasize is that accessibility increases profitability. So it's not just required by law, but it also offers tremendous potential to tap into a market of millions of people with disabilities. So the first question that some of you may have right now is, how many people with disabilities are there? And no one really knows for sure, because not everybody is comfortable and willing to come forward with disclosing their disability. But from the various statistics that are available, the data ranges anywhere between 15 to 25% of the world's population as having some disability. Now, that could mean that includes both people with visible disabilities as well as people with hidden disabilities that may still require some accommodations or auxiliary aids to be able to access certain products or services. So I think we can safely say that roughly 20% of the world's population has a disability. And if your products and services don't accommodate those disabilities, then those potential customers are not going to buy them, because they will either not be able to use them at all, or it will be too difficult for them to use them, especially if competing solutions that are accessible are available. So let's illustrate this with some examples here. So starting with the iPhone 3GS, way back when, Apple incorporated a screen reader called VoiceOver into its products. And since then, many other accessibility features have been incorporated into iPhones, iPads, Macs, and so on, including the screen magnifiers, features for people with physical disabilities, hearing disabilities, hearing aid compatibility, mono audio, and other hearing assisted features, and even features for people with developmental disabilities like guided access. At the other end of the spectrum, Domino's Pizza fought the Americans with Disabilities Act for 6 years. Instead of investing the resources needed to make their website and mobile apps accessible, they went all the way up to the Supreme Court to try to argue that the ADA did not require them to make their digital platforms accessible. And they ultimately lost. As a result, they not only lost potentially hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions of dollars litigating a lawsuit that they ultimately lost in the Supreme Court and then settled on accessibility, but also angered many blind customers who now favor other popular pizza chains as a result of this. So continuing on the business case, it is important to note that incorporating accessibility at the design and implementation phase of product development is generally drastically cheaper than retrofitting it into existing products. And I will turn it over to Mark to expound upon that a bit here.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I'm glad you brought it up because it really does fit into the profitability equation. Like, you want to be able to do it right at the right phase of your engineering and your implementation project. So to use an analogy in building architecture, folks who look at universal design or accessibility in buildings and architecture, they think about you can design a building and then you can just sort of add on something like wheelchair ramps. You can add on features, you can change out door handles, replace them to make them accessible for wheelchair users, or you can design it in right from the beginning. So you might be able to look at a design and say, well, let's design this without any entry stairs on the front or back. And so instead of having stairs that go in, you just design it with a type of system, a ramp system, or just an overall site design that's accessible without having to add in some additional structure. And so that's a classic case from the world of universal design. This basically shows that, like, if you think about this from the beginning, you can make design decisions which actually obviate the need for kind of bolt-on modifications later. So for one thing, you end up with a much more elegant design, a product that's far more attractive because you thought of it from the beginning. And the other sense, it's a lot less expensive to kind of retrofit. But in the technology world, there's a few kind of really easy examples we can go to. So one is, I've got on the slide, apps that use graphics instead of text fields. So it's super easy to render to graphics instead of rendering to the system supported text generation and rendering tools. So for example, in the world of both Windows and Apple applications, there are programming libraries where you can push text to the system and have it display them in the right way. Well, and that makes the text available for copy paste. It makes the text available for screen readers. And so all the technology that's related to text can do that. However, if you're developing an application that's intended to run on Mac and Linux and Windows, then you might be tempted to say, well, we're just going to have our own platform anyway. So we see a strategy like this with the Adobe products, where they don't generally use the system's text rendering capabilities for their text because they want to make it, partially because they want to make an application that runs across platforms. So they choose not to do that, and that has implications on how usable those applications are. For these different kinds of accessibility tools for screen readers, but also partially for elegance. You don't have the ability to control how the application works through the operating system. So those are some of the kind of examples that happen there with that part of app development. Another piece that happens is on input control. So designing for easy keyboard control, not depending on a touchscreen exclusively or not depending on long scrolling menus. That can make a big difference for the design of applications that make it compatible with screen readers, but also for motor control input devices, where you're making it easier. If let's say that you have one functional hand, you're making it easier to operate your computer with only that one hand instead of two. By using things like hierarchical menus. So on the slide, I've got an example here where we've got a hierarchical menu or a long scroll down menu, and it shows an example of kind of one of these is easier to use. So there's actually a really good UXL course called Design Accessibility. I've got a link to it in the slides you can get at the end, and it gives a good intro. So if you're a software developer, or if you're a product designer, whether you're talking about the front panel of a desk phone, like a SIP phone, or you're talking about an app that's going to run on a mobile device, or you're talking about a website, like, there are some good standardized principles that you can start with that will help you design to do this a lot better. So, one trend I've noticed is newer features, or companies are trying to drop functionality that's important for compatibility or important for kind of regular use of the system. So we're going to talk a little bit about ViaTalk and their attempt to kind of streamline customer support. They say, well, we're not going to do customer support over telephone. So that was their strategy. And you can think of other implications as well for other types of platforms. So if you're rolling out some kind of new communication service, it's easy and it's kind of tempting for high-tech product developers to just leave things out and remove those from the what they think of as older features, but they're not really necessarily thinking about kind of what the implications are going to be for those simplifying pieces, those what you could think of as core technology that we're removing from the application that might make it difficult to use for an impaired user. So Michael, we're talking about the profitability question. I understand there's certain kinds of contracts that are really going to be, they're going to require that the technology be designed in an accessible way, or else those buyers are not going to be able to purchase. Can you tell us some more about those kind of contracts?
There are indeed, and the driving force behind those contracts is Section 508 of the Federal Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And that law requires departments and agencies of the executive branch of the federal government to procure, develop, use, and maintain electronic and information technologies that are accessible to employees and members of the public with disabilities. So under Section 508, really the key requirement here for this audience is the requirement to procure or purchase technology that is accessible. Most government agencies do not manufacture or design their own technology. They rely on entering into contracts with private sector vendors to obtain their IT. So when technology is not accessible, a government agency is prohibited from buying that technology unless no accessible alternative that meets its needs is commercially available. If there is no fully accessible option that meets the federal agency's needs, then under the best meets exception, the government agency is obligated to purchase the technology that comes closest to conforming with the law. So how does this impact the private sector? Well, if you have a government contract and your product is not accessible, you may not get the contract at all, which could potentially cost your business thousands or even millions of dollars. Or even if you do get the contract, it may be conditioned on bringing the product into conformance with Section 508 requirements, possibly on a short timeline, which could require significant software or hardware redesigns, reformatting documentation to make sure that it is accessible or that it's available to people with disabilities in alternate formats. So it could be a really big deal. So that's at the federal level, but then at the state and local level, many states and some local governments have enacted their own Section 508-like laws applicable to procurement at the state and local level. So in the public sector, it's really a big deal. And another thing to consider is if a federal or state agency does buy your inaccessible product and that agency then gets sued, even if your company will not have any exposure to direct liability, the company's brand can quickly get dragged into the mud.
I'll bet.
Exactly. So then the next big consideration, and one that I think is highly overlooked in the business sphere is that accessibility doesn't just benefit people with disabilities. Accessibility benefits everyone. First off, mainstream products or features can become accessibility game changers. For example, let's start off with popular voice assistants like Amazon's. I won't mention her name because I'm going to set off everybody's devices since we are in a virtual session here. I'll just call her Lady A. So Apple's Siri and Amazon's Lady A were not initially designed for people with disabilities. For instance, when Amazon's assistant first came out, and I would say the wake word, I did not get any verbal indicator that my Echo device heard me and that it was ready to listen to and process my command. So I had to kind of just assume that it did hear me and start talking. So it wasn't a deal breaker, but I knew that it would have been very useful to have that functionality. Well, within a year or two, it became available. And when I invoke her, I hear an audio tone that alerts me to the fact that she's listening to me. And then when she's done listening to me, I get another audio tone that she's done and processing my request. So that is a very cool and useful feature to have and to give me the feedback that previously was only available by what I understand to be a light or some other visual indicator that allowed a sighted person to know that the assistant is ready to process their request. Another good example here is that a voice assistant can make a smart home appliance accessible to a blind person who might not otherwise be able to control it. For example, let's take the example of a smart microwave. As most of you have probably taken completely for granted, almost all modern microwaves do not have any tactile buttons. They just have a flat panel that makes it impossible to discern and identify any of the controls purely by touch. If you can see the microwave and see the button labels, obviously it's not a problem, but for somebody who is blind, if they don't put some tactile markings on them, or bump dots or braille labels, there's no way to know where the different buttons are. Well, a smart home assistant can remove that barrier by allowing partial or full voice control of the device, like by saying just a Siri microwave for 3 minutes, or Siri defrost for 10 minutes. But voice assistants are not just useful for people with visual disabilities. They can also help people with limited manual dexterity or other physical disabilities. For example, smart locks, which were not designed specifically for people with disabilities, but to, for example, allow somebody to unlock the door to their home or garage remotely to maybe let a cleaning lady or somebody in while they're not home, can also be a game changer for somebody who is partially or fully paralyzed and has difficulty manipulating a key to unlock a physical lock. Another mainstream device that came out more recently, the Apple Vision Pro, is already having numerous benefits for people with disabilities. For example, there have been stories there has been an account of a low vision person whom the Apple Vision Pro has helped control their nystagmus, which is an eye condition that leads to involuntary movement of the eyes, which actually happens to be a condition that I myself have. I have no control over my eye movements. And once the Apple Vision Pro opens up its camera to third parties, it will be an even more tremendous game changer because it will allow people who are totally blind to use various assistive features hands-free, like, for example, access popular visual interpreting services like Ira or Be My Eyes, which connect them with a sighted person that can describe to them via the video link their surroundings, including any obstacles if they are traveling, or help them identify signage or get other critical visual information. So that feature is not available yet, but just imagine something as simple as opening up a built-in camera to third-party developers, how tremendous of something that little could be of a game changer for people with disabilities.
Yeah, I think that story that you referred to was in the New York Magazine. It was actually just last month in June 2024. And I've got on the slide, I've got the first few lines of it. It's called "I Know What the Apple Vision Pro is For." And it's kind of a funny title because some people say, well, I don't quite understand what this is for, but it tells the story of how it's actually very useful for certain applications. The subtitles, the headset is already changing disabled users' lives. And that's like Michael just said, it's without the sort of the full capability to use all the resources on the device. And often that's how you see high-tech products go. They sort of start with a kind of a closed or a walled garden approach where the developer has all of the internal controls, and then it's up to them, and it's actually pretty expensive internally to innovate, to add that connectivity for those functionalities later. So you'll see that in Apple products a lot. Internally they had, just to pick a non-accessibility example, they had multitasking in iPhones initially, but it was only for the actual Apple applications that could use it. That you couldn't build a separate application that had multitasking. You couldn't use Spotify at the same time you were doing something else. They eventually came back and they added that, and so they will sometimes add these features later. So that's what Michael's referring to. Is basically an expectation that, well, they're going to open up the cameras that are currently they have exclusive use of for their applications. They're going to open that up to be more useful for other application developers. And of course, that's good for Apple because then they sell apps, and people buy the Apple Vision Pro in order to use those apps like Ira and Be My Eyes. So I love that example. On my iPhone and my Mac and other tools, I often will go to the accessibility settings to find things that are useful. I actually have a lot of them activated on my computer right now. So like this general idea that accessibility features benefit everybody, it's really common, and I think it points to the fact that like product designers can get a lot of value for an expanded market, but also for what they thought of as their existing market, simply by understanding kind of what's going to be useful for basically a bigger audience, a broader audience. But so these things are really very broadly applicable and useful. And actually, we've got a few more examples. Michael, I'll let you talk about.
Yeah, so just as mainstream features can and often do become accessibility game changers, the opposite is the case as well. That is, functionalities that are built into products specifically to improve or enhance accessibility are also often useful to people without disabilities. For example, captioning is essential to make auditory content accessible to people who are deaf or hard of hearing, but it can also be useful to, for instance, someone who has trouble understanding someone speaking because they may have a heavy foreign accent or otherwise not speak clearly. So having that text to supplement what they hear can be useful even for somebody who does not have any hearing limitations at all. In another situation, optical character recognition, OCR, which extracts the text from an image, say a picture of text, like a scanned image of a PDF, is essential for screen reader users because a blind user relying on screen reading software cannot tell if a picture is a picture of a document or a picture of a house or a picture of something totally different. But it also allows the document to be quickly and efficiently searchable by everyone, including people without disabilities. Then we have audio description for videos, which is the insertion of auditory narrations of the visual descriptions of a movie, TV show, or live performance to people who are blind or low vision, such as the costumes, what people are wearing, what they are doing, any visual elements of the performance. But it can also help a sighted person who is multitasking and may prefer to just listen to what is going on and not have to also look at the screen to get the full picture of what they are watching. Finally, here is something that may be close to home to a lot of people here. I'm sure we've all used elevators and have gone through automatic doors at grocery stores, airports, and other facilities. Well, guess what? Most of those accommodations were put into place to allow access to users of wheelchairs, walkers, and other mobility devices. But of course, they're routinely also used by people who are carrying luggage or pushing a cart, pushing a stroller. So those uses have absolutely nothing to do with the disability, but they have become so important to those particular experiences.
Yeah, that I didn't know that about elevators being built for wheelchair-based users, but it's true. They really do seem like the design was thought through, obviously, before you and I were alive, and so it's much easier to manage. I can imagine if people were developing an elevator today, it would just have this, touchscreen and kind of be. I often think those touchscreen interfaces are a little challenging and not always really super well thought through. So they really have made it that thinking has made it much easier to manage. That's a really interesting example. So you also mentioned, and I would like to ask you to tell us about like how accessibility is required, but there's actually some real costs associated with non-compliance. Can you tell us some more there?
Yes. Accessibility is required by various laws. First, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, which is a broad anti-discrimination law. It's not specifically a digital accessibility law, but it does reach digital accessibility. It prohibits disability discrimination in employment, the programs, services, and activities of public entities, and most relevant to our audience, places of public accommodation. And there are state equivalents also, like the California's UNRU Act, the New York Human Rights Law, Illinois Human Rights Act, that have provide similar protections at the state level. So for places of public accommodations, websites and mobile apps must be made accessible to people with disabilities, but the law doesn't specify a specific standard for doing so. Now, there are a few exceptions to this obligation. There is an undue burden exception, a fundamental alteration exception, and also a public safety, health or safety threat exception, which though all of those are narrow exceptions, and the burden to prove them is high. In addition to that, covered businesses must communicate effectively with employees and customers with disabilities. So this means, for instance, that documents may need to be provided in alternate formats upon request, such as Braille, large print, audio, or even American Sign Language for someone for whom ASL is the primary method of communication. And then we have telecom specific accessibility laws, which refer, which are much less oriented around access to places and programs as to the accessibility of specific products or services, to make sure that if somebody buys a handset or a video playback equipment like a VCR, a DVD player, a Blu-ray player, a soft phone, that those pieces of hardware and software are accessible to and usable by people with disabilities. So the two laws here are the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act, CVAA, and Section 255 of the Communications Act. So together, I won't go into all the details of the requirements of these laws, but in a nutshell, these laws require telecom equipment and services, as well as advanced communication services, to be accessible to and usable by people with disabilities, if readily achievable, or unless doing so is not achievable, depending on the type of product. So accessible means that the products are services are operable by people with disabilities, while usability refers to the accessibility of product support channels. That is both product support documentation, like user guides, manuals, training videos, as well as accessible product support, such as making sure that phone support is available for someone who prefers or needs to communicate orally due to their disability because they have difficulty or cannot write or type, to submit a support request via email or through a web form. So I'd like to go a little bit more about the distinctions between Section 255 and the CVAA. So the CVAA applies to advanced communication services, which consist of non-interconnected VoIP, which is basically can be one-way VoIP, like inbound or outbound only. It can also include purely online voice communication platforms that do not allow any connectivity to the public switched telephone network. It also covers electronic messaging services like text messaging, email, instant messaging, and even live chat functionalities on websites. It also covers all types of video conferencing services, ranging from professional video conferencing, enterprise grade video conferencing solutions to popular video conferencing platforms like Zoom, Teams, and WebEx, and even solutions like WhatsApp, Skype, more consumer-oriented video calling solutions. And most recently, the requirements are also being extended to inmate calling services. Basically, any services that allow inmates to communicate via audio or video with anyone outside the prison or jail where they are confined.
I think one of the interesting kind of questions that comes up here is how to know whether something is readily achievable, or achievable depending on the type of product or service. So that's something maybe we could talk about as we get time, in some of the questions at the end, sort of like some of that, and probably I think some of the other examples you're going to bring up might help us kind of feel that out, because as an engineer, like that basically I'm trying to work out, like on a particular product, I'm trying to work out like what's my checklist of items. I'm going to make a Jira ticket for every one of these new user stories that define how it needs to be, how this new service needs to function. And so I need to know which ones need to go on there. And all of these are a matter of investment. I'm going to be investing as a product manager. I'm going to be investing time and labor and things like that to deploy these. So sort of being able to figure out what's readily achievable or what's not readily achievable is something I'm going to need to do. And so we don't have to dig into that right this minute, but that's something that comes to mind as a product developer that we'll want to get some better understanding on. I think you
say now that these standards are not clear cut, and these defenses are highly fact intensive and difficult to establish.
Gotcha. So I know you've mentioned to me some of the accessibility record keeping requirements, and then a little bit about enforcement. Can you tell me some more about what we should know there?
Yeah, absolutely. So covered entities under both Section 255 and the CVAA are required to maintain in their ordinary course of business records of all their efforts to comply with the accessibility and usability requirements, including descriptions of the accessibility features of their products and services, their efforts to consult with people with disabilities, as well as compatibility with third-party peripheral devices available to people with disabilities at nominal cost. So it is very important to comply with these record-keeping requirements, because in the event of an enforcement proceeding, whether in a response to a consumer complaint or to a Federal Communications Commission investigation, it is the burden falls on the covered entity to show that the product or service is accessible or usable. And the FCC will not accept conclusory statements of accessibility. They're going to ask for documentation, concrete evidence. So if that evidence cannot be produced, then the entity will, the company will lose. So getting more into the enforcement, under the ADA, there are a handful of law firms that file hundreds, some even thousands of so-called drive-by or click-by lawsuits under Title III of the ADA. They basically troll websites looking for any accessibility violations they can find, including some minor issues of like unlabeled buttons or graphics not having alt text. And then when they find those issues, especially with the websites of small businesses, they'll find a plaintiff who's willing to sue, and they'll file a lawsuit and pressure those entities to settle those lawsuits for a quick buck, because they know that those companies are too small to fight and try to prove that they have complied with the law to defend themselves. So this is arguably the biggest risk that businesses, especially B2C businesses, but even B2B companies are not necessarily immune from these types of lawsuits. And then we get into so with the CVAA and Section 255, there is no private right of action, meaning that an aggrieved consumer cannot file a lawsuit in court. They have to go through the FCC. And there are so basically the first step in the enforcement process is to try to resolve the issue in good faith with the manufacturer or service provider. And to do that, there are a couple options. A consumer with a disability can initiate a request for dispute assistance, which is a mediation process in which the FCC Disability Rights Office serves as a mediator. Or they can just try to informally deal with the manufacturer service provider first, and then if that doesn't get them anywhere, file a formal complaint. In almost all cases, consumers go the RDA route, and then if unsuccessful, file an informal complaint with the FCC. And there are a few decisions that the FCC has come down with in this realm. In July 2022, the FCC fined Verizon $100,000. And this was very much a unique case because it was more of a case of non-compliance with FCC rules requiring cooperation with investigations rather than with accessibility. Although the FCC did find that that Verizon made an insufficient showing that its premium visual voicemail service was accessible to a hard of hearing customer who was relying on visual voicemail because visual voicemail produces a text transcript of the audio of voicemail messages. And so instead of responding fully to the complaint, Verizon was selective about its responses. For example, it provided only information about complaints that were escalated to executive level management, rather than also including complaints that were brought up with Verizon's customer service center. It also tried to shift the blame to the customer for using an unsupported device, but could not substantiate that device was in fact incompatible with its voicemail service. And basically, as a result of that, the FCC said, Verizon, you did not give us enough information to make a factual finding as to whether your premium visual voicemail service is in fact accessible to people with disabilities.
Yeah, I think, well, I'll just mention the visual voicemail case, like you said, it's really interesting because the FCC in their ruling, which is easy to read, it's really written by, technical people, it walks through kind of, well, this is what Verizon could have done. And they actually gave examples of, well, if they had provided us something like this, then that would have been an example of what would have been helpful. So you could tell that they were really writing kind of a lesson statement of like, this is what we would have expected at this phase or in answer to this question. And you can also see that Verizon had a very normal viewpoint from an engineering perspective. They have the people who operate the network. They have the people who operate the voicemail platform. They have the people who do integrations with devices. There was a particular Samsung device that was in question in that case that the user was using. And it was something that was specifically sold to be compatible with Verizon services. But you could tell there was probably some sort of Android interop problem there. But Verizon never went so far as to specifically test it. In fact, the FCC said, well, they could have just said, which devices did you test this on? And actually showed that there was some efforts to make this functionality available. And we're not actually talking, it's an interesting thing here, we're not actually talking about something special that they were supposed to do in order to make the service work, to make it, basically more accessible or functional for someone with a disability. It was really just, does the product work at all? It was kind of, because if it worked at all, then it would have actually generated the transcript of the first 45 seconds of the voicemail, and everyone would have been happy. The customer would have been happy. So it's really just a basic functionality, simple product functionality product. But it also goes back to the fact that they developed a feature that was really useful for a hard of hearing user, which is great. It was really useful for everybody to have a transcription of your voicemail. It's just that their testing and they were not very, according to the FCC record, they were not very effective at ensuring that that feature actually worked on all of the devices that were being sold and admitted to connect to the Verizon network. So there were a lot of kind of gaps there. And you can kind of tell, like, well, Verizon's a large organization. There were a lot of different teams involved here. And so there was a little bit of, like you said, there was record keeping. They couldn't really say what they had tested, although somebody knew what they had tested. There were spreadsheets somewhere that document what they had tested, but it probably wasn't really documented with this kind of use case in mind. So I think it's a really interesting lesson in kind of in how you can do it and how you can respond and how you can do a better job. But and it's actually it's really not that challenging to see how they could end up, and you could accidentally end up in a situation like this. But I think it really serves as a good educational example, and hopefully they've were able to kind of make it right and resolve things well and actually get the service, because it was clearly a feature that they intended to make work on that particular Android device if they could have. It's just probably some sort of interop problem with a particular device or a particular version of software. Verizon never said that we intended for it not to work on that model. So it's a very interesting case. I'm glad you brought this one up.
Thank you for adding that perspective, Mark. I do want to be sure to talk about the ViaTalk case, because that is specifically an interconnected VoIP case. ViaTalk, an interconnected VoIP provider, was cited for failing to provide accessible technical support to a quadriplegic customer. For those who do not know, a person who is quadriplegic is essentially paralyzed from the neck down. So essentially, the only way they can control devices is by voice, eye movements, but really through facial and head movements, because they have no functional use of any of their limbs. The customer had issues accessing their VoIP service. ViaTalk tried to resolve them by providing a new adapter, but that did not fully work out, because the customer sought telephone technical support to install and set up the adapter, because the online portal that the company had was not accessible to the quadriplegic customer. And when he tried to do that, he did not get the support that he needed, because the company did not want to schedule a callback because he threatened legal action. Well, the FCC said that doesn't excuse a provider from not from its usability obligation to provide accessible technical support. The company is under no obligation to provide any legal advice or weigh in on any of the customers' comments as to the merits of their legal claim, but they still had the obligation to schedule the call and make sure to get him up and running with that service. So in this case, the FCC did not impose any monetary penalties, but it did order Viatalk to reach out to the consumer to schedule a call within 2 weeks, and then to actually have that call within 28 days of the order, and to report on its compliance to the FCC. So I think a big takeaway from the Viatalk case is, well, one, you got to have that usability, the accessible product support, including accessible technical support options, but also that penalties, that sometimes the cost of the measures that are required to bring a business into compliance can be even higher than any direct monetary penalties that the FCC may impose.
Yeah, this one was really surprising, partially because there's a general assumption that, well, we can modify our customer service and our customer support to work the way we want. If we want to do a certain kind of customer support, we should be able to do that, and that makes it okay. But I think what they're saying here is, well, no, actually making a phone call, scheduling a call is certainly readily achievable. And I'm using that in an informal sense. They certainly have the ability to make phone calls at this Viatalk voice service provider, and so that's how they were driven to do so. Well, with our time, I want to switch over for anyone who's able to stay. And we'll take the questions that Michael has time to take. We have a few live questions that came in. And I want to give you a chance at least a couple of those, Michael. So one of those questions is, what are some organizations, or are there organizations that help companies be sure their product has all the necessary accessibility features?
There are indeed. They are often referred to as accessibility consulting companies or accessibility consulting firms, accessibility testing companies, companies like Level Access, DQ Systems, spelled DEQUE, Accessibility Partners, Converge Accessibility, and many others. And those organizations, they can do both automated and manual testing of your websites, products, mobile apps, help identify gaps and propose remedial measures. And most of those organizations are flexible enough to accommodate any budgets. If you're looking to test just a specific mission critical area of your digital environment, they can do that. Or if you want something more comprehensive, they can do that as well.
That's good. It sounds like so you listed off, 5 or 6 companies. It sounds like there's a lot of competition in that space. So that's actually helpful to know that there are several options available.
They're not all created equal, of course. Some of them specialize in some areas of digital accessibility more than others. So it's always good to do your research and consider which company's consulting services may be best suited to your company's needs.
That's a good pointer. Well, let me ask you another question. So you mentioned these drive-by lawsuits. Are there some steps that a company can take to reduce the risks of being sued in one of these drive-by or click-through lawsuits?
Yes, absolutely. So even though the ADA does not prescribe a specific minimum standard, most web accessibility lawsuits settle at WCAG 2.1 levels, A and AA, either 2.1 or 2.0. And WCAG stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. This is an internationally recognized industry standard for digital accessibility that has been developed and maintained by the World Wide Web Consortium. So that is the biggest, the best thing that can be done to mitigate the risk of those lawsuits. But in the meantime, of course, that's easier said than done. If a website or product is significantly or completely inaccessible, it's going to take time to bring it into conformance. So in the meantime, it is important to offer alternative access methods. For example, if you offer a web portal to submit technical support requests, to create a support ticket, offer alternatives like being able to submit the request over the phone or via email. And in addition to meeting your accessibility obligations, it can also help people without disabilities resolve their issues quicker, because sometimes you can just make a phone call and you might be able to resolve the issue in real time with the support agent on that call. So that is yet another example of how something created to meet an accessibility requirement can also benefit people without disabilities. I also highly recommend consulting with people with disabilities. It is easy to well, okay, I'll take a step back. It's not maybe necessarily easy to design for technical conformance, but it can be easy to make a website technically compliant, but not functionally accessible. And people with disabilities are in the best position to let you know if your website or product actually works for them. Mark, were you going to add something?
No, this is great. I was thinking about the customer service side. As a product designer, you would say, well, you can sometimes provide the customer service, and I guess I'm thinking of, like you said, if you're only going to provide one means for customer support, then maybe you should provide others as well. And often what's chosen there is the least cost means of customer service for the provider. And sometimes that's done kind of in a vacuum of what the value is lost. Like you said, like often just being able to call somebody who's competent and trained and who has the right permissions is going to be able to resolve the problem. But that can be a relatively expensive operation to have customer service hours where you can get a live person, versus being able to process tickets that come in as emails or chat format. That can be a lower cost because you can kind of multitask more. You can have more concurrency. There's product design reasons where you might decide that that's a lot less expensive, but you really are losing out a lot for your entire customer base, regardless. So that's good. So is there is there a kind of coordinator that can be brought in to help, or some sort of, like, if you wanted to bring in kind of a special expert to help you with making your application accessible, what would that job role be? What kind of responsibilities would they have?
Yeah, so hiring an accessibility coordinator, or if your company can afford it, establishing a whole accessibility department or team can certainly go a long way in demonstrating the company's commitment to accessibility and making sure that no important considerations are overseen. And that's really what a coordinator does. A coordinator oversees accessibility implementations. A coordinator works with the people who are responsible for implementing accessibility. That's both the software creators as well as content creators, outside or in-house counsel and consultants who advise on the legal requirements. In a nutshell, the job of the coordinator is to hold everything together, to make sure that the implementation of accessibility moves smoothly. And one related consideration is that when you are considering accessibility, it's not a one and done thing. Accessibility needs to be considered not only at the initial design stage, but also whenever you are redesigning a product or creating a new version of a product. A classic example of where that went horribly wrong was with the company Sonos with its speaker products. The company released a horrible update to its iOS and Android apps in May that pretty much broke the accessibility of apps that had been fully accessible for years to screen reader users. And the company got some bad press as a result from the National Federation of the Blind, which publicly condemned and deplored its actions. And within a few weeks, the company had to scramble to release several updates to implement fixes to that new software release that the company was so excited about that they forgot about its blind customers.
And I can, as a, from being on engineering teams, product teams, I can see how that can happen. Especially if you rotate out the team or you say, well, we're going to replace the app, we've got a brand new rebuild. Then a lot of times you can kind of scrap your old checklists and your old, your requirements, your design requirements. We're going to start off fresh. We're going to design something completely new here, folks. And everyone's excited about it. And you may have a lot of new innovations, but you've attempted to kind of optimize away some of the things that you didn't necessarily understand why they were there, from the development of the app. That's a great point. And, I hate it for the Sonos users who suffered, lost functionality of their equipment through that. But it's a good lesson to learn about. Like, the point that you're making is great. To basically keep that in mind and keep that active as part of your requirements definition and monitoring and testing, and basically your product rollout as you're bringing your product out, bringing it to customers, that they continue to keep this on the list of requirements that you work with. And that really points to basically the idea of having this accessibility compliance coordinator can provide you some mind share, somebody who continues to think about it. And so even while everyone else is busy with other parts of product implementation, you've actually got somebody who's specifically putting time and energy into thinking about it. There's two more questions I want to ask you that came in. Just briefly, as briefly as you feel comfortable with. One would be, can you help us start to think about how we consider whether a feature or an accessibility function is readily achievable? Get me started. Like, how would I talk through the business managers or the product managers who are not really necessarily very knowledgeable about these matters? How do we talk through whether adding this particular functionality is something that's readily achievable or not?
Yeah, that is definitely a difficult question to answer, and one which, before ultimately relying on that as a defense, I would highly recommend consulting with experienced legal counsel. But I will walk through the factors. So under the readily achievable standard, there are basically three considerations that the FCC looks at. And before I go into each of them, ultimately the decision is always made on a case-by-case basis. So there is never absolute certainty as to whether the FCC will agree or disagree with a readily achievable determination. So with that out of the way, the three factors are the the nature of the steps needed to meet an accessibility or usability requirement, the cost of each of those actions, and the manufacturer or service provider's overall resources. So for the first factor, the nature of the steps needed, that is, what do I need to do to satisfy a particular requirement? Do I need to put a nib on the 5 so that a blind person can use the desk phone? Do I need to make the caller ID information audibly readable? So all of this requires documentation and specific estimates of the incremental costs of the steps needed to make those determinations. So that's the nature, the nature and the cost. And then when it comes to total resources, the company has to look at all resources that are available to it. So it cannot just say, we budgeted X for accessibility, but the actual cost to do this would be, Y, therefore it's not readily achievable. You have to look at the company's total resources, including the resources of its parent company, if applicable, and any resources that are available to the company from third-party sources that could be diverted to accessibility. So, as I'm sure you can all imagine, this is a highly complex analysis that requires a detailed cost estimates, detailed documentation. You can't just say, we have to redesign our products from the ground up. It's going to generate substantial costs, therefore it's not readily achievable or achievable. You have to go through these factors and back up your analysis and conclusions with hard data. But there are some practical pointers that I can identify that should provide additional guidance. As a general matter, large companies are going to have to do more to achieve access than small companies because they have more resources available to them. So that is a big one. And then under the achievable analysis for advanced communication services, the factors are somewhat different. A couple unique factors under that analysis are to what extent are accessible products or services being offered at with varying levels of functionalities and at varying price points. So for example, with VoIP desk phones, suppose you have a low-end range of phones, a mid-range series of phones, and a high-end series of phones. You need to make sure that accessibility is incorporated across all 3 ranges of products. Similarly, if you're a service provider, whether you're a wholesaler or a reseller, accessibility cannot just be offered in the premium in a premium upgrade to a subscription. It has to be offered in the basic or free packages as well. The idea being that if you require a person with a disability to pay extra for accessibility, then you're discriminating and not providing equal access.
That's actually really helpful. And I'm going to share again the contact information for you here as well. One final question I do want to put to you came in from a viewer on the webinar asking about what have you seen in terms of artificial intelligence in this space? Is it playing any kind of role in enhancing accessibility or maybe degrading accessibility of services or technologies? Is it making any changes that you've been aware of for people with disabilities?
As a matter of fact, it is playing a significant role. In recent releases of iOS, Apple has introduced screen and text recognition features that rely on AI to create automatically generated descriptions of images, unlabeled buttons, or other controls. And some of those descriptions can make an otherwise inaccessible app at least partially accessible to a blind user. Now, of course, that should not be treated as an excuse not to build in accessibility, because those descriptions are not always accurate. Like AI in other contexts, they can and do hallucinate, and sometimes they're not able to describe certain images at all. But it can help meaningfully in some instances. As for the Windows environment, the developer of JAWS, which is the most popular screen reader for the PC, has recently introduced a feature called Picture Smart AI, which you can use to upload, pretty much take any image, and the AI will describe that for you. And it's actually been integrated into popular with popular AI chatbots like Google's Gemini. So AI has come a long way in enhancing accessibility, but there is certainly potential for certain AI solutions to be released without accessibility in mind, and to also hinder accessibility, such as, for example, to screen out candidates from employment because the job posting requires a driver license, and if an AI chatbot sees that somebody uploaded their state ID instead of a quote-unquote driver's license, it will eliminate their application from consideration before someone from HR has a chance to do a manual review.
Right. Yeah, that reminds me of the DeMarco and Lister book, People, where automation can lead you down paths that you didn't intend, because there's a lot of implications of each of these decisions. So when you start automating things, like that example you gave is a really good warning for, like, it's easy to get this wrong without necessarily thinking through those implications, whereas a human would have who's in the loop would have some access to a smarter decision. Well, that's really cool, those features. I'll be excited to see how that evolves in the Apple and the Microsoft space for improvements for those AI tools. That seems like really good news, that there's some new capabilities there that are coming out in the newer version. So thanks for sharing that update, Michael. This has been really cool. I've appreciated your help and your expertise here, answering my questions as an engineer.
It's good to always think about, how will somebody who is totally blind going to use this product or service? How will somebody who has some vision interact with the product or service?
Mm-hmm.
How will someone who's colorblind, someone who's hard of hearing, someone who has a developmental disability, what can we do to make the experience as enjoyable and equal for them as for everybody else?
Yeah, that's a good grid to work from. So that makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you very much, Michael. Thank you for all of you who came and brought in some great questions. It seemed like our audience stayed all the way through the questions, Michael, so they were really interested in your feedback. Thanks to Marashlian Donahue for joining us in this. We've got some more compliance educational webinars that we're doing together with the ComLaw group, and so we're excited for those. But I appreciate your time. Thanks again, Michael.
Thank you, Mark.